Okay, I think whenever you're ready, Dr. Bankston, we can go ahead and start since we've got a good group here.
Great. Do you want to give any intro or just go ahead?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Jasmine George. I'm the president and founder of Morehouse School of Medicine our Science and Health Policy Group. And I'm here with Rachel McKinley. You can kind of give yourself an introduction. Rachel McKinley from Howard University Science Policy Association. She's the president of that organization, and we are here to talk a little bit about writing a science policy memo. We have Dr. Bankston here, who is the Chief Outreach Officer of the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. We also have our lovely reviewers here, Dr. Stephanie Davis from the National Institutes of Health Lung and Blood Institute. We also have Dr. Julianne McCall here. She is from the California, make sure I get this right. So California Initiative to Advance Precision Medicine. And we also have Dr. Chanel Matney here, who is the program officer in the Forum for Neuroscience and Nervous Systems and Disorders at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. So we've got wonderful experts in the field here to talk about science policy memos. And thank you to everybody who submitted a topic and a paragraph. At the end of this, we'll have breakout rooms and opportunities for you to improve and your policy memo and pick the brains of any of the experts here today. And even if you didn't fill out the policy memo paragraph, you can still have the opportunity to join a breakout session and ask any kind of questions of these people who are reviewers. So thank you so much for everybody coming, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Bankston.
Great, thank you. Great. So thanks so much for inviting me to talk to you about writing policy memos. I'm going to just start a little more broadly talking about communicating science policy to non-scientific audiences. So just as you think about the way you're writing policy, it's very different from the academic writing that you're used to. You've probably seen this diagram before. You know that academic writing starts with the background, followed by supporting details, results and conclusions, and policy writing is pretty much flips the argument. So you want to start with the bottom line, answer the question, so what, why do I care, and then add supporting details. So again, it's essentially a flipped argument from the academic way of writing. So when you're writing policy, these are a few questions to consider. Who is your audience? So in a non-scientific audience, but in a broader context. So is this at the state level? Is it federal? What scope is this as well? So we'll talk about that a little later. This also includes being aware of issues that are going on in policy that are currently being debated, who is engaging in them, so knowing the political landscape and how you can frame actionable solutions that you're proposing in your memo to problems that your audience might have or might be thinking about, and framing these based on constituency. So again, the framing will be important. In terms of the message, so you want to send this message to your particular audience. So depending on who that is, that'll be different. This message should be both accessible as well as relatable to them and meaningful based on what they're interested in, and also clearly answer the question of why do they care about the topic. And finally, the medium. Obviously, we're talking about writing here, but more broadly, the way that you communicate orally versus in writing will be different. So what is the most effective way to communicate your message to your audience? So again, here emphasize that this is your message to your audience, so it will be very specific to your particular situation. Oops. Okay. So thinking about writing specifically, so writing, those of us who have been in policy roles for a while, we know that writing is probably about 85% of the job. And so it's really important to think about how you're writing this in a very actionable way using active verbs, which convey a certain sense of leadership and responsibility, as well as you can use analogies and examples that can relate your topic to your audience. You want to also avoid jargon, so any euphemisms, cliches, word plays, and puns, etc. So really being very clear about what you're saying and in a plain language if you can. Also, you want to include only details that are critical to your story. So I think as scientists, we're used to including a lot of background, kind of beefing up with everything that we know about that topic. So policy writing is much more down to sort of what do they need to know? What is the minimum background they need to know to understand your story? So you really don't want to go too far in the weeds about everything that you know about that topic. It really should be, there's a balance between having enough detail to understand what you're saying versus being too detailed and having too much. So you'll learn that as you go in practice. You want to also be true to the facts. Obviously, most of policy is evidence-based, so it's good to research a topic and have some background information. As well as really, be ready to revise, rewrite, and cite your sources. So the way to really write policy is to practice. So expect to have a lot of drafts and rewrites in the process. So before we start sort of with the memo specifically, I want to just tell you a little bit about JSPG, since this is a collaborative workshop with JSPG, and you're all, I think, interested in knowing more. So JSPG is an internationally recognized open access and peer-reviewed publication. It's also a 501c3 nonprofit. And essentially, our goal is to publish policy work from early career scholars in policy and different topics. I'll show you a little later. And through this process, through publication, editing, you can really gain experience in writing and researching policy. But we really want to sort of take this beyond the publication itself into engaging early career scholars in policy debates as well. And it's pretty broad, so we cover every corner of science and technology policy. And in addition to the publication, sort of after they're published, we promote through our mailing list, which is international, as well as events such as webinars, conferences, as well as a podcast that we started. You might have seen that on Twitter as well. So the types of write-ups that we publish go from sort of shorter technical things to longer, kind of more academic paper type of thing. So op-eds and memos would be shorter. Technology assessments is a specific kind of technology write-up. Policy analyses and white papers and some others here are sort of more what you think about more as a traditional academic paper. So it's really ranges as well in terms of length and formats. So here are all the areas, and I would say that there's probably even more. So, and a lot of these are really broad. So you can see just a few, to name a few things here. So we publish on AI, cybersecurity, national security, research policy, STEM education, et cetera. So it's really anything that you would think about as relating to public policy may or may not be here. We probably would accept it and look at it. So again, the whole idea is that it is really broad and meant to cover a lot of topics in policy. So so I guess just to give you a flavor of the kinds of things we've published and are upcoming, the one on the left here is an issue around equitable technology, which we published with the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth. So this is basically a youth group in the UN, which is pretty cool. So we had a webinar with them where we had kind of thought leaders around technology, as well as discussing with early career scientists on these topics, which is really nice. And so this is an interesting topic for the UN as well. So they have some meetings around these topics right now. And the other one that is upcoming is on climate change with the United Kingdom Science and Innovation Network. This is another large collaboration where they're actually doing a competition where you can submit. So the submission deadline is January 10th, so coming up soon. And they will have external reviewers, and the top 3 will be selected to present at the British Embassy. So I think it's pretty exciting as well. So if you're interested in climate change, this is another way to submit. And then we have other issues as well, but I think these are 2 good examples of the kinds of topics that we publish. And then as far as what happens after, so this is kind of where my role comes in as doing outreach. So we do webinars to showcase the authors as well as conferences, as I mentioned. So here, this is a webinar that we did with the UN around technology, which was really nice. We had one about space exploration here, which is basically a space conference where we had a couple of early career authors present. We had another one here, which is kind of broader around communication. So how do you translate your academic communication and scholarly work into policy? So we had kind of a mix of academics and policy folks, very nice discussion. And then we had one on climate change, which is this one. So in relation to the issue where we had experts from the US and the UK sort of in breakout rooms, again, discussing these high-level climate topics, which are interesting as well. So this was more along the lines of incentivizing authors to submit to the issue through the webinar. So the purpose will be different, but a lot of different resources as well. And you can watch these as well on the YouTube channel if you're interested in any of these topics. And then the podcast, as I mentioned, so it's called SciPol Soundbites. We're on season 2. We are doing sort of more topical discussions around different areas. So the first episode was on underrepresented minorities and different publications around this issue. So you can feel free to listen to this as well. So that's something that can be a good resource for people who are interested in going into policy as well, if you're listening to these podcasts as well. Okay. So now moving to the memo. So I wanted to just highlight JSPG a little bit because these are all the different types of write-ups that we publish, and this is actually from the editorial guidelines. And it does a nice job explaining the differences between the different write-ups. So as I mentioned, kind of shorter ones, you can see here, 2,000 words, all the way up to 35 pages. Some of them have analyses and recommendations and policy implications. Others don't. Op-eds express the opinion of an author versus other write-ups are more balanced and express both sides. And memos specifically, so they're directed to a specific person basically, or addressing a specific problem. And they usually have an executive summary, which is really helpful, and that's a good exercise to try to write. And it's directed to individuals specifically, so you could write a memo internally to your organization or outside, and that's different from what a policy analysis paper would be, for example. So if you want to learn more, you can look at the editorial guidelines. They actually have examples of one of each of these, and go through our volumes as well if you want to see more examples. So for memos specifically, these are, so basics to know is that memos, really anyone can write memos. It's for either policy advisors, advocates, or everyday citizens who want to affect change in their community. The purpose is essentially to inform and guide decision makers. So they usually have a really short amount of time, so they need to be able to understand what you're saying very quickly. Needs to be very concise and straightforward, and be able to sort of skim the document and understand what you're saying in about 30 seconds. And for policymakers specifically, so it's a vehicle to persuade and think about how they might act on a specific issue and try to inform that through the memo. And then most of the time they're written for uninformed but intelligent readers, and not necessarily people with a policy background. They could be directed to politicians or lobbyists, non-government organizations, community leaders, and public initiatives. So it's really pretty broad kind of write-up depending on who it's for. But just to keep this in mind that it is meant to persuade somebody to make a certain decision. And in addition to these concepts, so we can talk about a few other dimensions in terms of the scope. So you want to ask yourself why you're writing this. So is there a justification? Is there a need that the memo is filling in the community? Is there something that needs to be said that no one's saying? And also, conversely, what is the background? Has this been studied before? Has anybody written on this topic before? Also, who do you represent? So you're writing this as you, as your institution, as your state. Again, the scope will be different here, and important to say who you're representing when you're writing. And in terms of the larger context, so as I mentioned, you want to think about what prior legislation looks like, if what you propose has been done before. Again, how does this fit into sort of the prior research and documents on this topic? Also, if you're proposing funding, which a lot of times they do, you're asking for more funding to support a certain type of research, it's important to think about how this might be allocated and where it's coming from. So that's more complicated. We can talk about that later, but that is a common ask. And then more broadly, again, what is the political context and who you're writing to and what are their responses going to be? So here, this is where knowing the background on policymakers is important and their stance on certain issues, knowing who to go to and again, how they might react to what you're saying. So the structure, as you can see on the right, so it's also critical to have a good structure in order to make the point that you want to make, especially in terms of being clear, as well as concise. So you want to start again with a bottom line. Present your takeaway message at the top. This will be followed by relevant and concise background. Again, don't give all the background that you know, only what they need to understand in order to know what you're saying. And again, be very brief and be able to skim through that. And then you want to define the argument with relevant dimensions. So we'll talk about this a little later too. But in addition to being evidence-based, there are also other dimensions that you should consider. And it's important to not only state your recommendations, which are clear, it's also helpful to provide a blueprint of how you think these recommendations will be implemented, even if you don't put them in a memo, but it's likely that they'll ask about it. And it's good to think about the implementation ahead of time, as that will likely come up if they read the memo. So continuing with the idea of having a strategy for implementing policies. So these are some additional considerations for making the memo actually effective. So you should have a neutral and straightforward tone. Use active voice, which again suggests an ongoing problem, conveys a sense of urgency. And at the same time, it should be brief so the reader can understand your main points quickly, as well as objective. So showing both positive and negative on the issue is important. Again, even if you're just writing sort of the one side, it's good to be aware of what the counter argument might be. And obviously the audience is important. So you want them to be able to understand how the information that you're presenting is relevant to what they're working on, how it's going to translate into concrete recommendations. And concision is important. So again, your argument should be succinct without details that are not necessary, just what they need to know. And then, so it should also be substantiated. So you do need to have credible findings and evidence, as well as finally the political palatability, which is a lot of memos pertain to political issues. So it's important to consider the political positions of your readers and how they might respond to your recommendations. Again, knowing the background of them and what they have supported in the past and how they might react. So I thought it would be helpful to actually go through an example. I sent this paper out to Rachel and Jasmine to walk through the structure of this and see sort of how you might think about your topic. So you remember memos typically are directed towards individuals. So they would have a header and a summary that says who it's from, who it's to and from, and the date. The structure would be, you'll have some sort of summary at the top, follow the structure of what we know about the topic, what we recommend, what the limitations are, and what the barriers to that policy might be, and conclusions. So in this particular paper, I'll go through the executive summary. So just in the interest of time, I think this is a good structure to think about how this memo was written. So the I guess going through the background first. So the background is that the US has historically been a leader in STEM. However, in order for this to continue, there needs to be a steady stream of STEM professionals. So this comes down to how much the workforce is being supported. We need to have more STEM professionals in the system to meet the workforce demands. But this means that we need more diversity, essentially. And so the context is that the US has been a leader, isn't necessarily anymore, and what do we need to do? And the recommendations here, which I think I like this because I think it gives 3 really good ways to think about this idea. One is changing paid parental leave, which is a policy change. The second one is programs, so programs that encourage a STEM for all approach. And third is more financial resources. So any of these 3 ways might be ways that you might actually advocate for this in real life. And it's nice to see 3 different ideas. So to go through this systematically, so the problem, so it starts with what is the problem is that we know that there's many barriers in higher education to specific groups. Students take longer to graduate, there's low retention, and students feel unprepared to pursue STEM degrees. And ways to think about this is that you want to try and promote the sense of belonging and include more students in the educational system, as well as diversifying the workforce. So they specifically talk about women, underrepresented minorities, and individuals with disabilities. So knowing this is the problem, what is sort of the context? So the historical context is that, so we know that we need a highly skilled workforce. Education has leveled off, so fewer people are getting degrees or they're not finishing. On a global scale, we're also lagging behind other countries who are investing more in education. And however, at the same time, a lot of jobs actually require higher education training. So how do we mitigate this? And at the same time, we need more students from different backgrounds to really replenish the workforce and the demands that are in the job market. So the sort of then third part of this is how do we use this landscape now to make change, and what does that mean? So the data show that the workforce itself is lacking many groups. So some data from the Brookings Institute indicates that only 22% of STEM workers are women, 10% Asian, 6% Black, 9% Hispanic. And data from NSF show that students with disabilities are less likely to enroll in STEM graduate studies. So again, all of these populations are underrepresented. It's still a problem. It continues to be a problem, but that presents an opportunity for the US to work on this issue and cultivate the diversity. So how we might do that, and what do we think about? So how do we prepare students? How do we inspire students to get into education? We need a strong foundation of STEM leadership and education, at the same time, getting them excited about the STEM fields. And so the 3 different categories here, one is STEM literacy. So how do we create a workforce that can talk to citizens? How can citizens understand that science affects them and what that looks like in the community? Cultivating a STEM proficient workforce. So again, we need a more skilled workforce in the US educational system. And then cutting off the achievement gap. So again, there's a lot of untapped talent that we're still not recognizing and compensating. So the suggestions, as I mentioned, one is legislation, approved legislation on paid parental leave and equal pay, investing in programs that encourage STEM for all, and providing financial resources to minority students. And you can read more in the paper itself about how these are sort of unfolded and ideas for each one, but I think it's a good framework to think about, again, different ways that you might address this. So that's it for the example itself. So hopefully that was helpful in sort of unpacking this argument and how you might think about it. I think at the end, they also picked one favorite recommendation. So that's something you might also do, is say which one is more feasible, which one do you think should be done first, and so on. So comparing between the recommendations that you have. So before wrapping up, so I did mention that there are other dimensions to think about, and this is when you're further down, you sort of have a draft and you start to think about, is this feasible? What other things do I need to think about to revise? So one thing is having explicit transparency. So this means being really straightforward about the limitations of your recommendations, so understanding what you're proposing, but what is the counter argument to, and sort of the in-between things, criteria that you're thinking about to assess the success of, or the likelihood of success for your recommendations. And again, what counter arguments might there be? The transparency can be based on an initial cost benefit analysis. So this is a summary of essentially costs and benefits of each recommendation. So you might come up with a number of them and then narrow down to maybe one or two by considering how much cost and benefit each of them has. And that can be helpful for narrowing down to the ones that you actually propose. The stakeholder analysis, so this is more what is the impact in society, how are they going to respond, how are major political players going to respond, for example, and then framing the recommendation within the political context. Social impact analysis, so this is refers to looking at the broader social consequences of your recommendations. So again, for the most part, you need to explain how the recommendations address the problem at hand and kind of what the broader community impacts will be. So some of this will be also, I think, will help you kind of compare and contrast and figure out what the best recommendations are, which one is better than another by looking at all these factors. And feasibility, of course, in addition to these considerations, is important. So is it politically feasible, operationally feasible, and financially feasible? So if you have some idea that is maybe radical, that's fine, but it must be realistic and doable and kind of grounded within the political context as well. So these are things that I think you'll kind of get to as you practice and start to think about all these different factors when you do have some recommendations. And the last consideration is, how do you make this accessible and really think about diversity, equity, and inclusion when you're writing? So these are some of the principles that I found while I was looking up this topic. There's a lot more to this, but these are just a few kind of basic principles. So the first one is, you want to use people-centric language. So this means that focusing on the person and reflecting their individuality. You don't want to classify people, stereotype based on associating with a specific group. So this may be something that you're unconsciously doing. Just being aware of this, I think, is helpful. You also want to consider a strength-based approach. So that means, again, focusing on abilities, knowledge, and capacities of people, assuming positive things rather than a deficit approach related to individuals. Again, some of this will come out in the way you're writing, and just ask yourself whether this is something that is coming across this way or not. You also want to use terms that are defined by the community. So this is something that you learn within your specific topic. Different words may do different things, or there are specific ways that they refer to different concepts within your topic and community. That's something you learn once you're in the community for a while. And you also want to write for a global audience. So even though you might be US focused, you don't want to be too culturally sensitive to just the US. Again, depending on what you're writing on, but it's good to keep in mind a broader context. So on the flip side, you don't want to use any language that is prejudiced, stereotyped, or discriminatory, which is common sense, but sometimes things that you write might be perceived the wrong way, or just being aware of the words that you're using that and how they might be perceived. And then you don't want to write with unnecessarily gendered language. So as not to assign specific genders to a person. So one example I found, so instead of saying mailman, you can say mail carrier. Pronouns also go in here. Again, being aware of this as well. And then you don't want to use socially charged terms for technical concepts. So this is kind of a abstract concept, but basically you want to avoid certain terms that might be, again, misinterpreted. So instead of saying things like native speaker, first-class citizen, these are things that might be used widely. The recommendation is, instead of saying native, you can say built in to describe a feature that's part of a product. Instead of saying first class, you can say something that is essential, part of a product. Again, so things like this, I think in day-to-day life might mean something, but just be aware what that means within the policy context. And again, some of these terms may need to be replaced. And finally, don't apply ableist language. So this is one of the common things that you might be inclined to do, and you may not realize it. Ableism is defined as essentially a systematic way of devaluing bodies and minds that seem abnormal, quote unquote abnormal. So using things like crippled or dumb or insane, again, you probably wouldn't, but sometimes you might, and then think about replacing that. So one example that I found is that instead of saying give everything a final sanity check, you can say give everything a final check for completeness and clarity. So again, even though these are words that we use day to day, we should be careful about how we use them in writing. So here are some resources. So this is a question that I get asked a lot of times. So where can we publish? It depends what it is. So obviously JSPG is a more of an academic type of journal, which is very helpful, again, for building these skills and you're entering policy. But then there's also kind of more mainstream places to publish. So Medium and The Conversation, I think, are more open-ended. Some of these are more policy focused. LinkedIn posts are also good. Inside Higher Ed is also good. So these are just some examples and places to think about publishing policy pieces. And then these are resources. So I can share the slide deck. This is you can click on these. From ESEP, John Holdren has a good document about what not to do, avoid common pitfalls. Some of these have examples of memos as well that you could read. Broad Institute is a good one. And then Seattle University has a document about inclusive language where some of this came from, which is really good as well. So yeah, I'll share this so you can click through some of these, but I would encourage you to look up more in terms of inclusive language too, because that's something that will be important as you continue writing. And then finally, just some broad resources. Since I haven't spoken to your groups before, these are resources that I normally recommend for students who are interested in policy and different things you can do or look into. There's this paper from Yvette Seeger, From Pipettes to Science Policy, which is really nice and has some basics about policy as well as her career transition. In terms of kind of courses, so Activate to Captivate actually teaches communication skills. ASBMB has a course on the art of science communication, which is really helpful as well. It's an online 10-week course. I would encourage you to get involved with your scientific societies or organizations that may have a policy section like AAAS. Again, recommend JSPG for your professional development as well as the National Science Policy Network. FASEB is also good. I'm including here also a course that we taught recently through UC Irvine. So we have our all of our lectures on YouTube, which is also helpful. And then the SC Global Consortium, which is kind of a mix between policy and STS. So we're actually planning a conference for next spring that you can submit to. This may be another good opportunity for you to plug into policy. So let me know if you're interested and we can talk more about that conference as well. So here's my contact. Obviously, I've already been here before, but feel free to connect on LinkedIn and Twitter. And then this is the JSPG contact, our website. You can sign up for the newsletter to see what new issues are coming out. I included the podcast as well, and then our Twitter handle, Disciple Journal. So thanks. I guess I'll leave this up, or no, let me stop sharing so we can do Q&A and then we'll go back.
Awesome. So let's kick off with the questions before we go into our breakout rooms. Yes, Rachel.
Sorry, I was just doing the clapping reaction. I apologize for that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Any questions for Dr. Bankston before we kick off?
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
So I kind of see policy memo writing as kind of like a means to an end to push policy. So can you give like an example of any kind of recent policy memo that kind of pushed the envelope to creating a policy change in science?
Yeah, I think what I would say is that it wouldn't necessarily be a standalone thing. So a lot of times the memo might be kind of a first step to even like this kind of paper, like increasing diversity, that may start with a certain organization. A lot, like at least sort of in the real world, the way it works is that you would have you would write this to a specific person, then you would get kind of the community to engage on a larger letter around that topic. So a lot of the way advocacy happens is you may have like universities sign on to that. You may have societies. A lot of this ends up being kind of a community advocacy in the end. So I think the memo is a good starting point to kind of get the attention of the right person, but then there's more kind of that goes to that. To actually achieving policy change in that topic takes a lot longer than that, but it's a good initial step.
Okay, thank you.
I'm thinking of some specific examples of some memos that I saw when I was formerly a staffer in the California State Legislature working on transportation issues as a consultant. And so some of the policy memos that we came across, we actually used as consultants to inform or motivate statutes related to, for example, green technologies for a clean or battery operated vehicles. And so there's a policy institute called the University of California at Davis Institute for Transportation Studies. And this is one of the work products that they would push out and send to us. They might use the policy memo to email us, a copy. Often there'd be some nice visuals, and then perhaps that might inspire a whole session to sort of discuss that memo in more detail. So we could go back to the chair of our committees. This is an elected official who's going to be officiating a hearing where bills are about, let's say, green vehicles are under consideration. When we were thinking about the details of how that policy should be shaped, we could use the data that was presented at a very high level in the policy memo to sort of help guide, an appropriate framework. So that's one example of a policy memo sort of pushing the needle forward.
That's helpful. Julianne, did you want to go through your comment?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that a policy memo doesn't have to stand alone. It can be a summary of an existing report, even a massive one, multiple hundreds of pages long. In fact, the National Academy of Sciences is a leader in boiling down the absolute necessary parts of any of their 2,000 reference reports into one-page summaries, so that you can legitimately give it to a policymaker, and understanding that they have 5,000 topics that they need to cover in any given year, right? Which boils down to what 100 topics every single day, right, is what they're trying to manage. So having the opportunity to give them one page, which, like Adriana mentioned, right, starts with, okay, what's the message here, right? And if you want to learn more about the evidence, right, to have it so clearly defined in, bullet points even, so that they can, when they're in a hearing like Chanel with staff at the California legislature, it's right there on the page. They don't need to go searching for it.
Excellent point. Any other questions? Okay.
I actually have a question, and it's really kind of, I've always thought policy writing was a really interesting space, and I know that this is the first step by attending a meeting such as this, but how does one really kind of get into policy writing, maybe after PhD work or even master's level work, such as myself?
So I guess from my example, I actually did a lot of blogging, just writing. I think that's what I would say, that write about your topic to something like this, like Washington Post or somewhere that is not academic. And I think doing blog posts is a good way to learn how to do that. And also read these other things which are not academic, right? So you can read a lot of, societies have newsletters, New York Times is a good resource. So see how they write these things. I think, as I mentioned, JSPG is another good route of, publishing there, I think teaches you how to write as well. And then, if you want to get sort of more deeply into it, looking for internships or fellowships where you really would do that sort of more immersed into the space. I'm happy to talk more about kind of more opportunities in that space once you're a little bit more seasoned. I don't know if others have comments too.
Yeah, the communication, no matter what career you choose, you're going to have to be a good communicator, right? In written form, right? If you choose a career that demands that you are presenting to public audiences or specialized professional audiences, many policymakers require their staff to read their local newspapers. So I know that LA Times is, doesn't seem like very local, but there are certainly local aspects of the LA Times and the New York Times, and every major city will have its own local newspaper. If a topic shows up there, you better understand what it says before you arrive to work the next day, or that's your first task of the day is just to catch up on what's being blasted to the community on the headlines of their local newspaper. And in terms of like preparing for that, these nonprofit organizations, so many of you I'm sure, not that it's an expectation, when I started the CCST, the California Council on Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program, a one-year policy program for PhD scientists. The very first day of the fellowship is like, okay, the California legislature has 40 state senators and 80 assembly members, right? We were starting on very basic level. And so I don't expect that everybody knows the structure of government, right, in all of our own special academic tracks. But Congress, like 49 out of 50 state legislatures, has two houses. Typically in Congress, you have the US Senate and the US House of Representatives. What's called the third house, right? So those are two houses. The third house is all the external organizations. These are your nonprofit advocacy organizations. So in California, we have the California Pan-Ethnic Health Network, California Primary Care Association, California Healthcare Foundation. Obviously, my area is in health. And they are the ones who are developing relationships with policymakers and suggesting new bill ideas and shepherding those bills through the process. Once again, for one state like in California, there are 5,000 bills every single legislative session, right? One policymaker who has to vote on all 5,000 of those bills every session can't legitimately be an expert in all of those. They depend on their external network of organizations and experts. And so if you get onto the email list of an organization, for example, when I was in college, I joined Autism Speaks. It was something that impacted my family, and I just wanted to be a part of moving that organization forward. There's typically like a legislative affairs branch, and they're the ones saying like, okay, we're waving a flag. Everybody call their legislators right now. Like, this is a script. Here are the main points you need to touch on, or letter writing campaigns, or hey, let's drive to the Capitol and make our demands known, or at least our areas of expertise and perspective. So that gave me a language, right? I mean, already in undergrad, before I ever thought I would pursue a policy career, it gave me a language that I could build on once I got into this field. So nonprofits everywhere, you can find the one that you're most passionate about and throw your weight and talent and expertise into it.
Awesome answer. Lawrence, I see that you have your hand up.
Yes, sorry, I had to turn my camera off. My internet's slowing down. But so being that like publications are really important for graduate students, do students who write policy memos get any kind of like credit for citations, or if that policy memo gets picked up by like a representative and used in something, like, is there any kind of like way that, you know, that policy memo gets like noted somewhere in the records that, hey, I was part of that process?
Unlike in the academic world where your attribution is so critical and folks really care about authorship and, you know, the order in which the names appear on the top, as that is a currency, right, for evaluation and promotion. That's a little bit less the case in the policy world. I've seen a number of memos where it's just, you know, title, subline, and you don't see anyone's names there at all. It'll be a policy memo presented by an office or a center or an institution. That's not always the case. Certainly, however, I would highly encourage all of you to, in your own resumes and CVs, absolutely list all of the memos that you've contributed on. That's one thing to do as you begin building your portfolio, is keeping track. In a digital world, you can list those things on your LinkedIn. If you choose to have a personal website, you can link to those on your website. And so certainly it's very important as you're promoting yourself and your skills, your experiences, and you're talking about your past talents, to absolutely bring it up. It's just the nature of, I suppose, the culture of the policy world places a little bit less emphasis on team names being listed at the top, but that doesn't mean at all that you shouldn't take every advantage to use that to demonstrate sort of what you've contributed in that space. This is also a great opportunity as we're talking about, you know, ways to start practicing policy memo writing. I'm here. One of the reasons that I'm here is how I serve in my capacity with the National Science Policy Network, NSPN, as their mentorship and professional development coordinator. And so there's a new project that's just launching. This is very early stages, but there's an opportunity to submit a policy memo to Journal of Science Policy and Governance for an upcoming special issue called Science, the Endless Frontier, the Future of Science Policy. This is like so perfect for this group, right? It's honoring the 75th anniversary of a seminal report by a man called Vannevar Bush, which he wrote a policy memo, essentially, to then President Roosevelt, essentially outlining a framework for a federalized sort of nationwide science infrastructure. It sort of set into motion this entire idea of university-based research institutions, and ended up becoming sort of the vision that we see today of, you know, sort of how research in the US, you know, runs as an enterprise. So now that we're 75 years sort of past that, you know, initial big idea, this issue is sort of honoring or asking the question, where do we go next? We're constantly innovating, not just science, but the way that we do science, the way that we perform science. So how do we make it more inclusive? You know, where are the gaps? Are we even asking the right questions? You know, how has the pandemic in some ways, you know, highlighted a lot of the challenges that still exist for trainees, you know, in this space, all of the, you know, diversity, inclusion, and equity issues. Anyway, for people who are interested in perhaps writing this memo, which is due in April, so it's a bit of a crunch timeline, we're going to be pairing mentors to either individual contributors or to teams of people that band together to write a paper together. And this writing mentor would help guide you through a policy memo writing process. So keep an eye out for announcements. We'd be, you know, taking applications to hear from you on if you'd like to write, what you'd like to write about and why. and sort of what experience you might already have with writing and where you're specifically looking for help. And my team would then try to very thoughtfully and intentionally and joyfully match you to the right person. So you can find out more about this on NSPN, which is where I'm at, but also Jasmine and Rachel are plugged in. And so I'll definitely be sharing all of the information you would need to get plugged in with them. And I know that they can help me disseminate it out to the group. So that's an upcoming opportunity for mentorship and policy writing practice. So stay tuned.
So thanks for that plug. I just shared a link to the page. So this specific write-up will be kind of more policy papers. And there will be a writing workshop in early January that you can sign up for as well, with a few of the experts giving an intro and talking about how you write this type of write-up. And then we'll have breakout rooms and practice as well. So you can sign up for that as well until January 1st, I believe is the deadline.
Wonderful. We have time for a couple more questions and then we'll head out to our breakout rooms. Any further questions? Okay, I will now move everybody into breakout rooms. Give me a second. And Dr. Banks and I've just left whomever is left into our room. Yes, I think I did it correctly.
Okay.
Yes, I think that's a good even split. I think there's like 4 to 5 people per room. Okay, so just a little bit about the breakout rooms. If you submitted a topic, I tried to split it by who submitted a topic, so each room has like a person who submitted a topic. But if you are interested, you can ask more questions. We have each of our panelists here, and you can ask a question. I mean, I have questions pertaining to my topic, but I do want to open up the floor for additional questions before I go into those types of things. So anybody want to start?
Yeah, if you could just give a quick summary of your paragraph, maybe not read everything, or if you can read it, it's also if you want, but just remind me what it is.
So my topic was on gentrification, eviction, and displacement and how it can affect mental and cardiovascular health. And I briefly talked a little bit about the rates specifically in Atlanta, because Atlanta is the one of the fifth highest rates of gentrification, displacement, and eviction in the nation. And I talked about how the rent increases around 3 times every year since 2018. And I talked about how that has been shown ties to poor mental health and cardiovascular health through a loss of healthcare access and a loss of resources based off of displacement areas, including like rural areas specifically. And I gave a few recommendations. One was to obviously expand public health care so that regardless of the movement of the person, they would still be able to have some semblance of coverage. My next recommendation was to encourage the affordable housing retainment during development. Also expanding access to low income housing tax credits to incentivize the development of rent control housing, and specifically in Georgia to remove the statewide ban on rent control, which has kind of crushed African American and Latinx communities in Atlanta.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're doing like research for writing policy memos or any other type of policy writing, what resources do you use to look up your facts?
Do you want me to answer, Dr. Bankston?
Anybody?
I can answer from my standpoint. I looked at, first and foremost, I kind of Googled gentrification rates, and I was able to find the Atlanta Federal Reserve. I was able to find the World Health Organization data. There's tons of, as they said, nonprofits also have direct sources to data that you can use. So that's kind of how I approached it.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. It's hard because it's not like the academic type of, like somebody made a comment recently, like there's no PubMed for, the topics that you're writing on. So a lot of it is just Googling and figuring out what kind of the reputable sources are for that topic. For kind of the latest news, I would say like Google News, a lot of times is good if you typed in your term there and see kind of what the latest things are. Yeah, like Jasmine said, organizations are good, nonprofits, societies. I think for a lot of these things, it depends on what it is, but in my world, a lot of it has been related to research policy and higher education. So a lot of different groups advocate for the same thing. So it's easy to find kind of like, what does this society do or say about this topic? A lot of societies also have newsletters where they'll summarize like the top federal news, or like what did the president do, what is the latest on animal research or whatever that topic is, society is interested in. So that's a good way to find out kind of what the latest things are based on the topic.
Another thing I would say is,
yeah.
Especially Georgia is pretty good at this. They have a very transparent kind of list of all of the bills that are going to be tackled in the Georgia state government. So if you are interested in like a specific, as Dr. Bankston says, you can write around a specific bill, like advocating for a bill or something of that nature, that would also be a very good avenue to go into.
Is there like an archive of like past bills or like?
Yeah. It's just, you can sort it by time frame or by what was tabled, what was not tabled. There's like a lot of different ways that you can sort it.
Okay.
Yeah, and then if you go to congress.gov, has all the federal bills and the history of this, who supported it, where it is in the legislative process. But then, yeah, like Jasmine said, there are also state-specific resources, which you'd have to look up. But yeah, congress.gov is good too.
Yeah.
Thank y'all.
Yeah, no worries. Any other questions? One of my questions would be what are some ways that I can kind of expand what I already have? I know you said that it's best to not have it as jargon heavy. And I know a lot about like cardiovascular health, mental health, but how do I balance, I guess, my science knowledge and putting like all of it into one section versus, just stating with the facts, or, what are some recommendations on that?
Yeah, I think, looking at this, I would say I would suggest narrowing down to maybe one topic or maybe one group, because you get a lot of issues in here. So you could pack this up and write probably several memos based on these topics that you have. So I think like what I was mentioning is thinking about who it's for. So like housing inequality, for example, that's something a lot of policymakers advocate or have had statements on. So knowing like who to go to. Yeah, and then as far as the jargon, so I think maybe one good way to look this up is see if there's any bills on this topic and see how they wrote it, because they're usually very general. They'll say like 80% of Georgia has this issue or whatever. They'll have some data, but it'll be like a very broad, high level. And then they would recommend certain things in there. I would even also say like looking at some of the JSPG papers might help, because it's I think it's kind of a compromise. Like it's a little bit academic, but also makes broad recommendations. So if you look up through some of the papers and find one on one of these topics, then you can kind of see that it has evidence, but the recommendations that they make are very broad that a policymaker would understand, right? So the example that I gave is even just saying like, we need more funding for academia to support minority programs. So, it's very specific to what the ask is, but then it's also something that pretty much anybody can get behind it, right? So you want to get like really high level to where you get a lot of support for that, because in the real world, you'd have, like I mentioned, like you have kind of like, in my case, the higher education community advocating for something. So if UC writes a letter saying we would like to advocate for more funding for this topic, we'd have a letter that goes to Capitol Hill that's signed by a lot of different groups, right? So you want it to be something high level that pretty much anybody can sign on to. And then when you send it to a senator, they'll say like, okay, so the major organizations in the field signed on, like this is what they want, and like it's more credible that way. So yeah, it's a very big picture, I guess, if that makes sense. I think what you have isn't bad here. In your case, if you're going to like the state government, that's also different, because maybe you could include more state data. So I think, because this topic, I think could go either way, depending on who you're writing it for, right? And then you would slightly shift the message to whether it's a federal or a state person that you're addressing it to, right? Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you guys usually get like responses for your memos, or like what happens after you release the memo?
It depends what it's for. So a lot of it, sometimes it'll be like internal within the organization. So we would write a memo to like the president of the group or something. And if you send it to a policymaker, I think I would say it's usually part of a package of a number of things. So like usually if you're really kind of high level, changing legislation on something takes a lot of advocacy. And this is something that gets kind of put in there as part of more documents. It's hard to say. It's kind of hard to know depending on what it is. The goal is to get it in front of the staffer for that specific senator or something to then use it for something. And you can, you don't always see the result immediately, I guess. It can take a while, but a lot of times it's like it's a good start, right? To get the conversation going with them on something. And then you might go back and say, like, can you write something else? Can you also engage in other groups? So it's very much like case by case, but it can definitely lead to change eventually. It won't necessarily be just from that one document though.
Well, after you, I do have a question kind of piggybacking off of that. After you've written and published it, could you potentially also, like when you're setting up meetings with your legislator, if you're addressing it to a specific legislator, whether it be federal or local, state, whether you can bring that with you and say, hey, you know, I sent this before, you know, these are our concerns, this is how we want, kind of like having like a nice structured, like kind of deliverable to add so that they don't forget you.
Yeah, and that's a really good topic, or good way to do it. So if you do it in a structured way, that's kind of why these Capitol Hill days are good, because usually you'll have like 3 or 4 asks, and then you kind of have this repeated thing where everybody goes and advocates for those 4. Like, so for me, if I went from I guess from the UC standpoint, we'd have basically multiple people in the system repeating the same message over and over to as many legislators as possible. And that's, you know, they can expect that because they know like advocacy days are happening on these 2 days of the year. Like they're going to hear about that. You can send it to them ahead of time. You can leave it, and you know, these things actually are good to leave with them when you're done. So they remember you, and when you email them again, they'll be like, oh, I remember you left this here. So yeah. It's important to create these materials that you can live with them too, hopefully.
Are those days like that like encouraging? Because it seems like, I don't know, like maybe it depends on who you're talking to, like what the response will be to what you're pushing. So is there usually like a positive response from the policymakers, or they're, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I would say yes. So a lot of this involves doing prior research too, because like for us, we already know who is supportive of higher education issues. So we go to them because there's a history of, you know, many years of this. Sometimes you'll have, you know, like a new senator that you're trying to convince, and then usually we'll write a letter saying, you know, welcome to the office, here's some information about UC. How can we be a resource to you? Like, let's have a meeting and tell us about, you know, what our priorities are. And some of this, I think, goes back to legislation too, because some of what we do is we try to get our priorities and language into the actual bill that they're writing. So that's part of advocacy, which is interesting. Yes, I would say generally it's pretty positive. If there are things that are really large, for example, we advocated for DACA for about 1.5 years or so, which was a big undertaking, which was successful. But there's a lot of documents, a lot of meetings, a lot of groups that are engaged in this, and you know, the Supreme Court was involved. So it's a big, big project, which, you know, was successful. But it took, I think it probably took about 1.5 years to do that. So it's just a lot of persistence.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, I think, let me see if I have any other questions. Anybody else have any other questions while I'm currently thinking? You can ask anything. We have an expert here. So any other questions?
I have a question. I hope I don't sound ridiculous by asking, but since the memos are published at some point in the Science Policy Journal, can you actually cite them, or I was just curious, and can you list them as actual publications on like your CV?
Yes, you can send them and list them. Yeah, it's basically like any normal publication. I think it's really helpful, especially when you're farther along in applying for like policy fellowships, to have these things, because they show that you're interested and you've had some experience writing, because you're going to do a lot of writing in your fellowship and your job. So the more of this you can do, the better, because you'll get experience and also have some things in your CV. In addition, I would recommend, like I mentioned, trying to write kind of for a mainstream publication too, like New York Times, if you can. I think there's ways to, I would say, do both. So like, because this is more kind of academic, but if you can then repackage this into a short kind of punchy write-up for New York Times, that would be really good for your CV too. I mean, it's hard to do, but I would try. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
More questions? Anybody have a topic that they would want
I
to?
have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
You've recommended writing for like newspaper websites and things like that several times. And how does one even go about doing that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so I would say I feel like it's hard to make connections. Like you just have to really persistent and like send your write-up to as many places as you can. You might have connections with the local newspaper that might be helpful. Sometimes that's easier than trying to get into a large thing like this that's very read, widely read. Yeah, I would say it's like start small and local, even if you're writing. So I used to do this, and I was thinking about this too. Like if you write press releases for your institution, that's also one way to do this, because it's essentially like the same idea. If you're like packaging research into another way of writing for the public, that is a way that some people have done it, like they've written for their university as well. Trying to think. And then some other ones I think Chanel mentioned, Massive Science, OPAD Project is one. So there's a few of these kind of blogs, Medium, which are not really academic, but also good for your CV that you can start with. And then you can also try for these larger ones, but I don't think there's any way to really get in. You just have to try and send it, and send it to as many as you can. So I don't have a better answer.
That's just really intimidating for a scientist. Just start writing places.
Well, I mean, to be fair, we do kind of just do that anyway. We kind of throw our hat in the ring and say, is my research interesting enough for your journal? So I would think
true. I mean, yeah, I never thought about it that way, but I guess so.
Yeah, we kind of just, and then we allow our reviewer number 2 to like kind of trash us, and then the other reviewers
tear us apart.
Yeah. So it can't be too, I feel like science prepares people in general for just really just the most brutal parts of like professionalism and things like that. You deal with a failure a lot, you deal with troubleshooting, and that's why our opinions, I feel, are so valuable, because we bring a very unique perspective based off of kind of the litany of failure and putting yourself out there.
Yeah, I think you really have to, you have to do that. I think so. One advice, I guess, would be write about something that you're interested in. So for me, like, my whole kind of advocacy has been for, early career scientists, improving the academic system. And now I'm more sort of shifting towards this idea, how do we train students for policy? And so I've always been in this kind of higher ed space and advocacy. And I just did blogging for a couple of years just about, how we should improve science. And, not all of them are competitive. Like you have to go through an application process. There's other blogs that will accept something if you pitch it to them. So there's a lot of early career blogs. And so that's a good way to get started, maybe get more comfortable with writing kind of non-academic pieces about some issue that you're interested in. For me, that actually was really helpful because it kind of evolved into this, like, then I had a portfolio of blogs that I could pull from and say, like, I've written about this, which they actually read when I applied for this job. So I was kind of surprised that they're like, well, you've written about, higher education stuff like 3 years ago. And so a lot of these things I think will be helpful when you're moving on and saying, like, you're gonna, I guess, start building kind of a body of experiences and things you've done, right? So when you apply for the job, then they'll say, okay, she's done all these things, right? So that's what I would say. Like, start with something that you're interested in, just write about it, tweet about it, and then see where you can plug in and do more. That kind of feeds on itself, I think. As you do more writing, then you'll get more comfortable. But yeah, and just try and submit it to these places. You never know. So trial and error, I think.
Okay. It just sounds really intimidating, but I understand.
We're getting more people. I wonder if I should call the rooms or if everybody else is kind of having more conversation. Now that we have Dr. Davis here, anybody have any other questions for her? It could be anything, it could be about experiences. This is an opportune moment. You've got a golden year here.
I should warn you all, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, I don't have legislative experience. My policy is purely program, I'm a program officer at the NIH, so I don't write policy memos very often as part of my job compared to somebody who maybe works as a congressional staffer, but a lot of the same principles of communication, like when you're writing, when I do memos, they're usually, communicating to like my branch chief or something. But a lot of the same principles still apply when you're writing, for example, funding opportunity announcements, which is something that I do as part of my job.
So you said funding opportunity announcements. What are some other kinds of like communications that you typically interact with for your job?
So one thing that I usually don't do this directly, but I work with a lot of contractors that their job is to draft up program reports. So, I work in the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, and we have contractors with RTI. And, one of the things that they are tasked to do is every few years to kind of communicate with the national academies and Congress and other stakeholders to kind of show the effect of our programs. They will do basically this pretty massive program evaluation. So they work with us to kind of gather the data they need to put that report together. And then, I'll often work with them to kind of put it together, edit it, make sure the facts are checked. And, then once it's published, we're kind of responsible for sharing it with our stakeholders. Other things, so I don't write these directly either, but I work pretty closely with our policy and communications office. So, I work with the small business program, and what we fund is mostly biotech companies. So let's say we have a biotech company that's just licensed their drug to a really big pharmaceutical company, and that's like a really big deal. So what we'll do is we'll often collaborate with the policy and communications office, connect them with our grantee, and we'll work together to put out like a short feature story as well. So usually these are no more than like a page, but it's just kind of a short article that's designed to go out to the research community, but also the public, just to kind of show the value of, what our program at the NIH does.
Oh yeah, I think I've seen a couple of them I think I saw one in 2015 when they were first rolling out the concept of precision medicine as like an avenue of where the US wants to go. So I think that's very interesting to talk to a real life person who actually writes these types of things or interacts with these types of things in their career.
And then other things that, people who are program officers or managers do is, in addition to kind of writing funding opportunity announcements. So for example, if you all are like, let's say you're going to apply for an F-31, the entire text to that grant announcement, that's what we do. So the program officers are in charge of basically writing that. And, one of the important considerations that we have to, take into account is that, we want to make sure when we're putting together the text for, a request for applications or, like a fellowship opportunity, we want to make sure that the language is very clear and that there's no room for, people to misinterpret it. Obviously, we're here to answer questions if there is some confusion, but, since this is something that people are going to be following when they're submitting their fellowship applications, it has to be something that is going to be really straightforward, and we don't have, a lot of pre-doc candidates following the wrong instructions because our language was too vague or it was easily misinterpreted.
Right, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, any lingering questions? So I will close up some of these rooms, give them a countdown so we can do our final remarks. And everybody can be on their way. If you're thinking of any other questions, please ask.
Okay, one more question.
Yeah.
So when people are writing for publications, like memos or anything like that, what are like, I kind of just want to see like examples of like what people are writing before they get into like policy memo writing positions. So like what topics are they writing about? How in depth are these like articles they're writing? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, you can definitely take a look at any of the articles on JSPG. They have very good examples of different various topics. Again, you saw in the presentation the sheer amount of topics. And you can also look for, communications from the NIH. You can look for other things to see how this language is being written about.
Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope we had really good conversations. I know we had some great questions in my room. Let me quickly share my screen to give the final remarks. Okay, so I just want to take time to thank all of our wonderful speaker and all of our wonderful reviewers. Dr. Bankston, thank you so much for coming here. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Dr. Myers-Davis, thank you so much for speaking with us. Dr. McCall and Dr. Matney, thank you so much for taking your time out of your day, your very busy schedules, to come and chat with some of our future, hopefully, policy leaders. If we have any other lingering questions, you feel free to ask now. And can anybody contact you? Like, are your DMs or emails open? I know I can add that to the slide deck if you want, or we can add it to the chat either way.
Yeah, my email is open. I'm going to put my Twitter handle in the chat as well, so feel free to follow me on there. But I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have about, the AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellows Program, working at the NIH, or just policy in general.
Wonderful. Well, if we don't have any other lingering things, I'll just allow people a moment to kind of put their information in the chat. And everybody can kind of grab that. We will be posting these recorded sessions for later use, especially for people who were not able to show up. We're currently coordinating with our schools to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row. So if we have a press release or not press release, but a video release or anything, we will send that down the proper channels. But if everybody is pretty much ready to go and enjoy their weekend, we can close. And once again, thank you to all of our wonderful speakers and reviewers, and I hope to hear from you guys soon. Alrighty.
All right.
Thank you,
Thank you all
everyone.
for attending.
Thank you all.
And this was
Thank
so
you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Much.
Everyone.
Bye.